9-year-old Toby didn't know the hulking man in the heavy leather vest was a high-ranking enforcer for the Hells Angels. He just saw someone who looked exactly as lonely as he felt. A simple half sandwich sparked a chain reaction that would literally shake the foundations of his elementary school. The late afternoon sun baked the cracked pavement of Bakersfield, California, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. 9-year-old Toby Jenkins dragged his feet, his worn-out sneakers scuffing the dirt path that bordered Centennial Park. He was small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a frame that looked like it could be blown over by a stiff breeze. Today, that frame was hunched under the weight of a faded blue backpack and a heavy heart. Toby always took the long way home. The direct route meant passing the local convenience store, which was the preferred loitering spot for Derek Thompson and his older brother's friends. Derek was a 12-year-old terror who had made it his personal mission to make Toby's life a living nightmare. From stolen lunch money to bruised ribs, Toby bore the silent, invisible scars of a kid who had fallen through the cracks of a negligent school system and an exhausted, single-parent household. His mother worked double shifts at a diner out on the highway, meaning Toby was entirely on his own from the time the school bell rang until the streetlights flickered on. As Toby navigated the dusty trail of the park, a low, rhythmic rumbling broke the silence. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped inside a metal cage. Parked illegally on the grass near a secluded grove of oak trees was a massive, custom Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Its chrome gleamed aggressively in the sun, matte black paint absorbing the heat. Sitting on a weathered wooden bench a few feet from the bike was a mountain of a man. He wore heavy denim jeans, scarred engineer boots, and a thick leather cut over a black t-shirt. The back of his vest proudly displayed the iconic red and white winged death's head patch, flanked by rockers that read Hells Angels and Bakersfield. His arms were thick with faded, intricate tattoos, and a long graying beard cascaded down his chest. His face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, dominated by a deep scar cutting through his left eyebrow. This was Mike Gallagher. On the streets, they called him Iron Mike. He was a veteran of the club, a man who had seen the inside of penitentiaries and the dark underbelly of the outlaw biker world. But right now, Mike didn't look dangerous. He looked entirely broken. Mike was staring blankly at the dirt between his boots, his massive shoulders slumped. In his right hand, he held a small, crumpled photograph. Today was the 10-year anniversary of the day his younger brother had been killed in a hit-and-run just 2 blocks from this very park. Mike came to this specific bench every year, sitting in absolute, brooding silence, consumed by a grief that decades of riding and brotherhood couldn't wash away. Toby froze, his instincts screaming at him to turn around and run. The man looked terrifying. Yet something kept Toby rooted to the spot. The boy knew what misery looked like. He saw it in the mirror every morning before school. He saw it in his mother's eyes when she looked at the unpaid utility bills. And he saw it now, radiating from the giant biker. Toby swallowed the lump in his throat and took a tentative step forward. Then another. Mike's peripheral vision caught the movement. His head snapped up, his pale blue eyes locking onto the scrawny kid. The biker's jaw tightened, irritated by the intrusion on his private morning. "Park's closed, kid," Mike rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Go play somewhere else." Toby flinched but didn't retreat. He clutched his hands tightly around the straps of his backpack. Slowly, he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out a small, slightly squashed object wrapped in aluminum foil. It was his lunch. He hadn't eaten it at school because Derek had cornered him in the cafeteria, forcing Toby to hide in the library. "You look sad." Toby said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the quiet park. "My mum says you shouldn't be sad on an empty stomach." Mike stared at the kid, dumbfounded. People usually crossed the street when they saw him coming. Grown men avoided eye contact. Cops watched him with hands resting on their holsters. And here was a kid, no taller than his waist, offering him charity. Toby took 2 more steps and gently placed the foil-wrapped package on the edge of the bench, giving the biker a wide berth. "It's just peanut butter and jelly, but it's the good jelly, strawberry." Mike looked from the sandwich to the boy. For a fleeting second, the hardened enforcer saw a ghost. His little brother used to trade his turkey sandwiches for strawberry jam in the 3rd grade. A heavy, suffocating knot tightened in Mike's chest. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and picked up the foil. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the perfectly cut diagonal halves. "You ain't eating?" Mike asked, his tone slightly less hostile. "I'm not hungry," Toby lied, his stomach immediately betraying him with a loud rumble. A faint, rusty chuckle escaped Mike's lips. It was a sound he hadn't made in weeks. He broke one of the halves into a smaller piece and held it out to Toby. "Sit. You don't insult a man by letting him eat alone." Hesitantly, Toby sat on the far edge of the bench. For the next 10 minutes, an unlikely silence settled over them. A feared outlaw biker and a bullied 9-year-old boy sharing a squashed peanut butter sandwich in the sweltering California heat. "I'm Mike," the biker grunted, wiping a crumb from his beard. "Toby." "Well, Toby," Mike said, his sharp eyes suddenly noticing the faint, yellowish bruising around the boy's collarbone that peeked out from his oversized t-shirt, and the nervous flinch every time a car drove past the park. "You better get home before your mum starts worrying." Toby nodded, grabbing his backpack. "Bye, Mike. I hope you feel better." Mike watched the boy trudge away, noting the slight limp in his walk. The biker's eyes narrowed. He knew the look of a victim. He folded the remaining piece of tin foil, slipped it into his leather vest pocket next to the photo of his brother, and felt a strange, protective spark ignite in his chest. The next morning dawned with a suffocating humidity that promised an unbearable day. For Toby, the weather was the least of his concerns. As he approached Oak Creek Elementary, a knot of pure dread formed in his stomach. He almost made it to the front doors. "Hey, trash!" A voice spat from the shadow of the portable classrooms. Toby froze. Derek Thompson stepped out from behind a dumpster, flanked by 2 of his larger, meaner cronies. They had been waiting. Derek had been reprimanded by a teacher the previous day because Toby had snitched by hiding in the library, and Derek was eager to exact his revenge. Before Toby could turn and run, a hand grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him violently into the secluded alley between the brick wall of the gymnasium and the chain-link fence. Toby hit the ground hard, scraping his palms and knees on the rough gravel. "Think you can hide from me?" Derek sneered, stepping forward and kicking Toby's backpack, scattering his notebooks and pencils into the dirt. "Leave me alone, Derek," Toby pleaded, scrambling backward. One of the older boys laughed, stepping on Toby's hand. "Make us." What followed was a brutal, terrifying 5 minutes. They tore the straps off Toby's backpack, stomped his plastic lunchbox into jagged shards, and shoved him repeatedly into the chain-link fence. When Toby finally tried to push back, Derek delivered a sharp punch to Toby's face, splitting his lip and sending him sprawling into a muddy puddle left over from the morning sprinklers. "Keep your mouth shut, or tomorrow is going to be worse," Derek hissed, spitting on Toby's ruined notebooks before the trio jogged away, laughing as the warning bell rang. Toby dragged himself into the school nurse's office 10 minutes later, covered in mud, blood, and tears. The nurse cleaned his split lip with terrifying indifference, handing him an ice pack before sending him to the principal's office. Principal Harrison was an exhausted administrator who cared more about the school's public image and avoiding paperwork than the safety of his students. He looked at Toby over the rim of his glasses, sighing heavily. "Toby, we've talked about this," Harrison said, leaning back in his leather chair. "You need to stop antagonizing the older boys. If you just stayed out of their way, these accidents wouldn't happen." "He hit me!" Toby cried, pointing to his swollen lip. "They broke my backpack." "Boys will be boys, Toby," Harrison replied dismissively. "Derek claims you tripped and fell into the fence, and 2 other students corroborated his story. I can't suspend a student based on your word alone. I'm sending you home for the day to clean up. I'll call your mother." Toby knew calling his mother meant she would lose a shift's pay to come get him, putting them further in debt. Defeated, shattered, and feeling utterly abandoned by the world, Toby walked out of the office. He didn't wait for his mother. He just started walking. He didn't go home. He went to the only place where someone hadn't looked at him with disgust or pity. An hour later, Mike Gallagher was still at Centennial Park. He hadn't planned on returning, but he had felt a strange, restless energy all morning. He was polishing the chrome exhaust pipes of his Harley when he heard a quiet, ragged sob behind him. Mike turned around. The rag dropped from his hand. Toby stood there, trembling. His face was a mess of dirt and drying blood. His lip was swollen to twice its size. A dark purple bruise was already blooming on his cheekbone, and his clothes were ripped and caked in wet mud. He was clutching the severed strap of his ruined backpack in one hand. Mike's blood ran cold, instantly replaced by a boiling, terrifying rage. The towering biker closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with the boy. "Who did this?" Mike demanded, his voice dangerously low. Toby couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam broke. He collapsed forward, burying his face into Mike's heavy leather vest, sobbing uncontrollably. He cried for the pain. He cried for his ruined lunchbox. And he cried because he was just so tired of being afraid. Mike didn't push him away. The terrifying enforcer of the Hells Angels wrapped his massive, tattooed arms around the small boy, letting him ruin his club colors with mud and tears. He held him steady until the sobs subsided into hiccups. "Tell me," Mike said softly, pulling back just enough to look Toby in the eye. Stammering, Toby told him everything. He told him about Derek Thompson. He told him about the ambush by the portable classrooms. And most importantly, he told him about Principal Harrison, who had looked the other way and sent him home for bleeding on the carpet. As Toby spoke, Mike's demeanor completely changed. The grieving, broken man from yesterday was gone. In his place was a stone-cold tactician, a man who organized defense strategies for an international motorcycle club. The Hells Angels operated on a strict, unyielding code of respect. You didn't touch women, and you never touched children. "Principal Harrison, huh?" Mike muttered, standing up. He seemed to grow another foot in height, blocking out the sun. "And Derek Thompson. Okay, Toby." Mike reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a heavy, black smartphone. He dialed a number from memory, pressing the phone to his ear. "Yeah, it's Mike," he said into the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to Richard Reaper Hayes, the president of the Bakersfield Charter. "Reaper, I need a favor," Mike said, his eyes never leaving Toby's bruised face. "No, not club business. Personal. But I need the whole charter." Mike paused, listening to the gruff voice on the other end. A grim, dangerous smile spread across his scarred face. "Yeah. Tomorrow morning. 7:30 a.m. We're taking a kid to school." Mike hung up the phone and looked down at Toby. "You clean up tonight, kid. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, you're not walking to school alone." That evening, the small, cramped apartment felt like a prison cell to Toby. He spent an hour in the bathroom, carefully washing the dried blood from his face with a ratty washcloth, wincing every time the rough fabric brushed his split lip. When his mother, Sarah, finally unlocked the front door just past midnight, smelling of stale diner coffee and industrial bleach, Toby was pretending to be asleep. He lay stiffly under his thin blanket, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm. Sarah cracked his bedroom door open, a sliver of hallway light falling across his bed. She lingered for a moment, her exhausted sigh filling the quiet room, before pulling the door shut. Toby let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He couldn't bear to see the look of absolute defeat in her eyes, if she saw his bruised face. She was already carrying the weight of the world. He refused to add his own suffering to her load. But as the first pale rays of dawn crept through his window blinds, the terror returned. Today was Wednesday. Derek had promised worse. Toby sat on the edge of his bed, his stomach churning with nauseating dread. He dressed slowly, pulling on a clean but faded graphic tee, and his only pair of jeans that didn't have holes in the knees. He gathered his school supplies, stuffing them into a plastic grocery bag since his backpack was destroyed. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah kissed him on the forehead on her way out the door for her morning shift, too rushed to notice the faint swelling that still lingered on his cheek in the dim light of the kitchen. "Have a good day, sweetie. Lock the door behind you," she called out, the deadbolt clicking shut. Toby sat at the small Formica kitchen table, staring at the clock. 7:20. 7:25. It was time to go. His legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at him to crawl back into bed and hide, but the school would just call his mother. He had no choice. He walked out onto the front porch of their duplex, locking the door with a trembling hand. The neighborhood was quiet, the heavy morning air still damp with dew. Then the silence broke. It started as a low, distant vibration, a bass note that seemed to hum through the very concrete of the sidewalk. Toby paused at the bottom of his porch steps. The sound grew louder, shifting from a hum to a deep, synchronized roar. It sounded like an earthquake rolling down Elm Street. Down at the intersection, a police cruiser with its lights flashing rounded the corner, moving slowly. But the police car wasn't chasing anyone. It was leading an escort. Behind the cruiser, turning onto Toby's narrow residential street, was a tidal wave of chrome, leather, and roaring V-twin engines. It wasn't just Mike. It was the entire Bakersfield charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, flanked by members from neighboring chapters who had answered the call. Over 60 heavily modified Harley-Davidsons rumbled in a perfect, staggered formation. The noise was deafening, a glorious, terrifying symphony of combustion that rattled the windows of every house on the block. Neighbors spilled out onto their front lawns, clutching coffee mugs, their eyes wide with shock and fear as the infamous 1%er Outlaw Club took over their quiet street. At the front of the pack rode Mike Gallagher. His massive frame was unmistakable. Riding parallel to him was a man with a graying, slicked-back ponytail and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Richard Reaper Hayes, the president of the charter. Mike raised a gloved fist. In perfect unison, the entire column of bikers engaged their clutches and brought the roaring beasts to a halt right in front of Toby's duplex. The engines idled, filling the air with the sharp scent of unburned gasoline and hot exhaust. Mike kicked his kickstand down and dismounted. He walked up the cracked concrete path, his heavy engineer boots thudding against the pavement. He looked down at Toby, his pale blue eyes softening just a fraction. "Told you weren't walking alone today, kid," Mike rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly over the idling engines. From behind, Mike stepped Reaper. The president of the charter looked intimidating enough to make grown men cross the street, but he knelt down to Toby's eye level. In his hands, he held a small, custom-made leather vest. It was a perfect miniature of the cuts the men wore. On the back, instead of the full-winged death's head patch, which had to be earned through blood and years of loyalty, it bore a custom rocker that read "Honorary Prospect" above the word Bakersfield. "Mike here says you're a tough kid," Reaper said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "Says you share your rations when a man is down. In our world, that makes you a brother, and nobody lays a hand on our brothers." Reaper held out the vest. Toby, his hands shaking with a mixture of awe and adrenaline, slipped his arms through the armholes. It smelled of fresh leather and motor oil. It fit perfectly. "All right, mount up," Mike said, pulling a spare, glossy black helmet from the sissy bar of his bike. He strapped it securely onto Toby's head. Mike lifted the boy with ease, setting him on the passenger pillion of his massive motorcycle. "Hold on to my belt. Don't let go." Toby wrapped his small arms around Mike's thick leather belt, gripping the heavy buckle. Mike swung his leg over the bike and kicked it into gear. He looked over at Reaper, who gave a sharp nod. With a twist of the throttle, Mike's bike roared back to life, louder than before. The entire column followed suit. The procession began to move, a mile-long parade of raw horsepower and uncompromising muscle, winding its way through the streets of Bakersfield. Toby had never felt anything like it. The wind whipped past his visor, the vibrations of the massive Evo motor resonating in his chest. He wasn't the scared, bullied kid from the duplex anymore. He was riding with giants. As they passed the convenience store where Derek usually hung out, Toby saw a group of teenagers drop their skateboards and stare in open-mouthed disbelief. Toby didn't shrink away. He sat up straighter, his small hands gripping Mike's belt tightly. Oak Creek Elementary was a beehive of morning activity. Yellow school buses were lining up in the designated loop, and hundreds of children were swarming the front courtyard. Parents were dropping off their kids in the car line. Teachers were blowing whistles, and the morning crossing guards were waving their stop signs. Then, the ground began to shake. The crossing guard at the main intersection blew her whistle, but the sound was completely drowned out by the approaching thunder. The police escort pulled into the school's main driveway, blocking both lanes of traffic. Behind it, the Hells Angels arrived. Panic and confusion rippled through the crowd of parents and teachers. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them back onto the grass. The school buses halted in their tracks. 60 roaring Harley-Davidsons poured into the bus loop, ignoring every traffic rule, painted line and crossing zone. They parked in a massive, sweeping semicircle that completely blockaded the front entrance of the school. The engines cut out in a cascading wave of silence, but the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 60 heavily tattooed, leather-clad outlaw bikers dismounted. They didn't shout, they didn't make a scene. They just stood there. A silent, imposing wall of muscle and leather, radiating an aura of absolute danger. Mike Gallagher walked his bike forward, stopping right at the base of the concrete steps that led to the main double doors. He reached back and lifted Toby off the seat, setting him gently on the ground. Toby stood in his oversized helmet and his custom leather cut, clutching his plastic grocery bag of school supplies. The sea of students parted like the Red Sea. Standing frozen near the brick retaining wall was Derek Thompson and his 2 older cronies. The color had completely drained from Derek's face. He looked like he was going to be sick. Mike placed a heavy hand on Toby's shoulder and guided him up the steps. The other bikers closed in behind them, forming an impenetrable, terrifying tunnel of escorts. "Which one is he?" Mike asked quietly. Toby raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at Derek. Mike didn't alter his pace. He walked Toby straight toward the bully. Derek's friends immediately scattered, abandoning him. Derek tried to back away, but his back hit the brick wall. He was trapped. Mike stopped inches from the terrified 12-year-old. The towering enforcer looked down at Derek, his scarred face devoid of any emotion. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "This boy is under our protection," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "If he trips on a shoelace, if he gets a paper cut, if he comes home with a speck of dirt on his shirt, I'm not going to talk to the principal. I'm going to come find you. Do we understand each other?" Derek, trembling so violently his teeth were chattering, could only manage a frantic, jerky nod. "Good," Mike grunted, turning his back on the boy. Suddenly, the front doors of the school flew open. Principal Harrison burst out, his face flushed red with indignation, flanked by two nervous-looking campus security guards. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison barked, his voice cracking slightly, as he took in the sheer number of bikers occupying his bus loop. "You can't be here. This is a school zone. I'm calling the police." "We brought the police with us, Harrison," Reaper said, stepping out from the crowd and walking up the steps to stand beside Mike. Harrison faltered, recognizing the man's undeniable authority. "You are trespassing. You are intimidating my students." Reaper pulled a thick manila envelope from the inside of his leather cut and slapped it hard against Harrison's chest, forcing the principal to grab it. "That is a compilation of every emergency room visit, every documented bruise, and every ignored complaint regarding Toby Jenkins over the last 6 months," Reaper said, his singular eye boring a hole through the administrator. "And the legal documentation at the back is from our club's retainer attorney up in Oakland. It outlines gross negligence, child endangerment, and a failure to enforce the district's anti-bullying mandate. If you ever dismiss this boy's injuries again, we will bankrupt this school district, and we will personally ensure you never work in education again." Harrison opened the envelope with trembling hands, scanning the legal letterhead. His arrogant facade crumbled instantly. He looked at Toby, then back at the towering bikers, realizing with horrifying clarity that he had just stepped into a war he could not win. "We will ensure Toby's absolute safety from now on," Harrison stammered, sweating profusely. "You're damn right you will," Reaper sneered. Mike knelt down in front of Toby one last time, unbuckling the heavy black helmet. He ruffled the boy's hair. "You go to class, kid. Hold your head up. You're never going to be afraid again. You hear me?" Toby looked at Mike, tears welling in his eyes. Not from fear, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in his life, he felt safe. "Thank you, Mike." "No," Mike said softly, tapping the breast pocket of his vest, where a piece of tin foil still rested. "Thank you for the sandwich." The angels didn't leave immediately. They stood on the lawn, their arms crossed, watching like silent sentinels as Toby walked through the front doors. As he passed down the hallway, students stepped aside, whispering in awe. He wasn't the weird, poor kid anymore. He was the kid who rode with the angels. Derek Thompson transferred to a different school district 3 days later. Principal Harrison was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation initiated by the mysterious Los Angeles attorney. As for Mike Gallagher, the empty, aching hole left by his brother's death finally began to heal. He started showing up at the Jenkins duplex on weekends, helping Sarah fix her car and teaching Toby how to use a wrench. A half-eaten peanut butter sandwich hadn't just saved a boy from a bully. It had given a lost, hardened outlaw, a reason to care again. What an incredible true story of brotherhood and unexpected heroes. Sometimes, the most terrifying people on the outside have the biggest hearts on the inside, proving that a single act of kindness can literally change your life. If this story gave you chills and warmed your heart, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing real-life stories.
Footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as a 7-year-old girl approached a house most grown men avoided. Inside sat a notorious Hell's Angel, oblivious to the folded piece of paper sliding into his rusty mailbox. It was a warning he ignored for 3 days. On day 4, everything changed. Thomas Hayes was not a man who expected good news in the mail. Known on the streets and within the deeply guarded Brotherhood of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club as Grinder, he was a 48-year-old veteran of the Vallejo Charter in Northern California. Grinder had spent 25 years wearing the famed red and white. His leather cut bore the iconic death head patch on the back, flanked by the top rocker reading Helles Ains and the bottom rocker proudly displaying Vallejo on his chest. The coveted 1% diamond patch served as a stark reminder to outsiders he lived by a different set of rules. His house sat at the end of a quiet, dead-end street. It was a modest, single-story ranch heavily fortified with chain-link fencing, blackout curtains, and a state-of-the-art security camera system. The neighborhood knew better than to complain about the deafening roar of his custom Harley-Davidson Road King at 2 in the morning. They also knew to keep a wide berth from the towering, heavily tattooed man whose history was woven into the gritty, violent fabric of California's most infamous biker wars. The Grinder, the battered, rust-eaten mailbox at the edge of his driveway, was nothing more than a receptacle for utility bills, junk mail, and the occasional court summons. He rarely checked it, and when he did, it was with a sneer of profound irritation. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon when the first note arrived. 7-year-old Lily Harrison lived 3 blocks away. She was a quiet, painfully thin girl who usually spent her afternoons riding a rusted tricycle up and down her own driveway, keeping her head down. But on this Tuesday, Lily was far from home. Her small hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of wide-ruled notebook paper. She kept looking over her shoulder, her wide, terrified eyes scanning the street for a specific, dark-colored sedan that had been haunting her neighborhood for weeks. Approaching Grinder's house felt like walking into the mouth of a dragon. The massive skull and wings insignia painted on the side of Grinder's garage seemed to glare down at her. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of classic rock echoing from inside the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Holding her breath, Lily darted forward, shoved the folded piece of paper through the rusted slot of the mailbox, and ran away as fast as her small legs could carry her. An hour later, Grinder stepped out onto his front porch. He was built like a cinder block, his arms covered in faded prison ink and freshly minted club tattoos. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the heavy afternoon air, and walked down the driveway to retrieve the mail. He pulled out a catalog for motorcycle parts, a final notice from the electric company, and a small, hastily folded square of lined paper. Grinder paused, his heady brow furrowing. He flipped the paper over. There was no stamp, no address, just the word "Please" scrawled on the outside in shaky, uneven pencil. For a brief second, curiosity flickered in the biker's cold eyes, but his mind was heavily occupied. The Vallejo Charter was currently embroiled in a high-stakes standoff. Rumors were swirling that the ATF had flipped an informant inside their inner circle. Tensions within the club were at a boiling point. Paranoia was the new currency. The chapter president, a ruthless man named Big Al Rossi, had put the entire club on lockdown. Nobody trusted anybody. Assuming the note was just garbage blown into the box, or a foolish prank by some local neighborhood kids daring each other to touch the Hells Angels property, Grinder didn't even bother unfolding it. He crumpled the paper in his massive fist and tossed it into the aluminum garbage can beside the garage. He had real problems to worry about. A piece of trash was the least of them. Wednesday arrived with a suffocating blanket of humidity. The tension within the club had only escalated overnight. Grinder had been up until dawn hosting an emergency church meeting, the mandatory, highly secretive gatherings of fully patched members. The air inside the house still reeked of stale beer, cheap cigars, and nervous sweat. At 3:15 p.m., Lily Harrison returned. This time she wasn't just scared, she was frantic. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she clutched a fresh piece of paper. She had watched Grinder toss her first warning away from her hiding spot behind the neighbor's overgrown hedges. She knew he hadn't read it. She knew he didn't understand the catastrophe that was quietly unspooling right under his nose. Lily crept up to the mailbox, her breathing shallow. She shoved the second note into the box, pushing it as far back as her little arm could reach, praying he would take it seriously this time. Just as she pulled her hand away, the heavy oak front door of Grinder's house swung open. "Hey!" a gruff voice barked. It wasn't Grinder. It was Dutch Miller, the chapter's volatile enforcer, stepping out onto the porch to spit a stream of tobacco juice. Dutch was a mountain of a man, with a thick, unkempt beard and a violent reputation that extended from Oakland all the way down to the San Bernardino-Burdu charters. Lily froze for a fraction of a second, letting out a sharp squeak of terror before bolting down the street. Dutch chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn neighborhood rats," he muttered as Grinder walked up behind him, wiping engine grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "What's out there?" Grinder asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just some kid messing around your property," Dutch replied, adjusting the heavy leather cut over his shoulders. "Probably daring each other to steal your mail." Grinder grunted in annoyance. He walked down to the box. Inside, he found the second piece of folded notebook paper. This time, the word "urgent" was written on the outside, heavily underlined, the pencil pressing so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. Grinder stared at it. The paranoia that had been cultivated over decades of outlaw life began to prickle at the back of his neck. In his world, nothing was a coincidence. Rivals like the Mongols of the Vagos were known for using unconventional methods to send messages, scout properties, or map out hits. Was this a cartel warning, a scout marking his house? He unfolded the note halfway, seeing the messy, childish scrawl inside. "Just kids," he told himself, exhaling a frustrated breath. "Just stupid kids playing stupid games." His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was a text from Big Al. "Fegs are moving. Lay low. Sweep the bikes." The urgency of the club's survival instantly eclipsed the childish note in his hand. Grinder shoved the half-opened paper into the back pocket of his greasy denim jeans, completely forgetting about it the moment he turned back toward his garage to tear his Harley apart, looking for tracking devices. By Thursday, the weather had broken. The oppressive heat gave way to a violent torrential downpour that turned the Vallejo streets into running rivers of mud and motor oil. The sky was a bruised, angry purple. Inside the house, the atmosphere was just as dark. Grinder hadn't slept in over 48 hours. He and Dutch had stripped 3 motorcycles down to the chassis, checking every wire and hollow tube for FBI bugs. They had found nothing, but the absence of evidence only fueled their deep-seated paranoia. If the feds weren't tracking the bikes, they were watching the house. If they weren't watching the house, there was a rat breathing their air, eating their food, sitting at their table. At 4 p.m., the rain was coming down in sheets. Lily Harrison was soaked to the bone. Her thin sneakers squelched in the puddles as she marched down the street. Her frayed pink backpack offered no protection against the storm. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue, but her face was set in a mask of pure, desperate determination. She knew what was going to happen tonight. She had heard them talking in her living room. The men with the heavy boots. The men who had locked her mother in the basement. She knew they were waiting for the cover of darkness. Lily reached the rusted mailbox. Her hands were numb from the cold. She pulled a Ziploc bag from her backpack. Inside the plastic bag was the third note. She had written it in bright red marker this time, hoping the violent color would finally force the terrifying biker to pay attention. She opened the mailbox, slid the plastic bag inside, and slammed the metal door shut. The metallic siang echoed loudly through the rain. Inside the garage, Grinder's head snapped up. He had his .25 caliber 1911 pistol laid out on the workbench, running an oiled cloth over the barrel. His nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Every shadow looked like a tactical raid team, every sound like a battering ram. He snatched the gun, chambered around with a sharp metallic clack, and stalked toward the front door. He peered through the peephole, but the rain was too heavy to see anything clearly. Cursing under his breath, Grinder tucked the pistol into the waistband of his jeans at the small of his back, threw open the door, and stepped out into the deluge. The street was utterly empty. The only movement was the heavy rain bouncing off the asphalt. Grinder walked to the mailbox, water instantly soaking through his dark t-shirt. He yanked the door open. There, sitting starkly against the rusted bottom, was the Ziploc bag. The bright red ink bled through the paper, distorted by the plastic but clearly visible. Grinder snatched it out of the box. His jaw tightened in pure fury. He was a sergeant-at-arms for the Hells Angels. He had survived stabbings, highway shootouts, and federal indictments. He was not going to be intimidated by someone playing games with his mailbox. He didn't open the bag. Instead, he shoved it into the deep interior pocket of his heavy leather club vest, intending to bring it to church and have the club's intelligence guy, a tech-savvy member named Cypher, run the bag for prints. Someone was mocking him. Someone was probing his defenses. When Grinder found out who it was, he was going to break them in half. He marched back into the house, locking 3 deadbolts behind him. Friday morning, day 4. The storm had passed, leaving a bright, glaring sunrise in its wake. The house was quiet. Dutch had left around midnight to report back to Big Al. Grinder was finally alone. He sat at his cramped kitchen table, a steaming mug of black bitter coffee in his hands. Exhaustion pulled at the bags under his eyes. The adrenaline of the past 3 days was crashing, leaving him feeling hollowed out and older than his 48 years. He stood up to gather his laundry. He picked up his heavy leather coat from the back of the dining chair. As he hoisted the 20-pound vest, he felt a crinkle of plastic in the inner pocket. Grinder paused. He reached inside and pulled out the Ziploc bag from yesterday. The third note. He stared at it for a long moment. The anger had burned out of him, replaced by a strange, creeping sense of dread. He set his coffee down. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his tactical folding knife. He sliced the top of the plastic bag open and carefully slid the piece of wide-ruled notebook paper out onto the wooden table. As he looked down at the bright red marker, a memory sparked. The second note. Grinder walked over to the pair of greasy jeans he had thrown in the corner 2 days ago. He dug his hand into the back pocket and pulled out the crumpled second note. He walked to the garbage can by the back door, dug through the dry paper waste at the top, and miraculously retrieved the first crumpled ball of paper he had discarded on Tuesday. He returned to the kitchen table. He flattened the first note. He flattened the second note. Then he looked at the third note, the one written in red. For the first time in 3 days, Thomas Grinder Hayes actually read the words. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's letters awkwardly sized, some written backward, the spelling entirely phonetic, but the message was brutally, undeniably clear. The first note read, "Mr. Biker, the men with star badges are bad. They are at my house." The second note read, "Mr. Biker, you are gent. My stepdad is crying. The men said they will kill my mom if he doesn't do the job." Grinder's breath caught in his throat. His blood ran instantly cold, a physical chill washing over his heavily tattooed arms. He looked down at the final note, the red ink glaring up at him under the harsh kitchen lights. The third note read, Mr. Biker, the men with star badges are fake cops. They are a rival club. I saw their tattoos. It is a snake. They made my stepdad put a bomb under your porch last night. Please don't start your motorcycle. Please save my mum. Grinder stopped breathing. A snake tattoo. The Vagos Motorcycle Club, the Green Nation. Bitter, blood-sworn rivals of the Hells Angels. And they had been under his house. Grinder slowly, meticulously lowered his eyes to the floorboards beneath his heavy combat boots. Right directly beneath the kitchen where he was sitting was the crawl space, and directly adjacent to the kitchen wall, separated by only an inch of drywall and a few studs, was his garage, where his Harley-Davidson was parked, where he had spent the last 2 days heavily scrubbing and aggressively stomping around. Please don't start your motorcycle. The little girl hadn't been playing a game. She hadn't been a scout for the feds. She was a hostage. She was collateral damage in a biker war she couldn't possibly understand, risking her life to stop an assassination. Grinder slowly stood up from the table, not making a sound, moving with the terrifying, calculated precision of a predator that has just realized it walked into a trap. He didn't reach for his keys. He didn't reach for the front door. He reached for his phone, and he reached for his gun. Day 4 had arrived, and the war had already begun. Grinder did not panic. Panic was a luxury dead men afforded themselves in their final seconds. Instead, decades of outlaw survival instincts took the wheel. He backed out of the kitchen with agonizing slowness, placing his boots exactly where he had stepped previously, hyper-aware of the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. He slipped out the back door and moved halfway across the muddy lawn before pulling out his encrypted burner phone. He hit a single speed dial number. "Yay!" Big Al Rossi's voice rasped on the other end, thick with sleep. "Al, it's Grinder. I need Breaker at my place. Now, no bikes, no noise. Bring him in through the back alley." "Feds?" Al asked, the sleep instantly vanishing from his tone. "Worse, Green Nation. They wired my house." 30 minutes later, a rusted plumbing van rolled silently to a stop behind Grinder's back fence. Out stepped Big Al Dutch and a wiry, scarred man named Breaker. Breaker was the Vallejo Charters demolitions and tech expert, an ex-combat engineer who had traded a military uniform for the red and white. Grinder met them at the fence, handing Big Al the 3 pieces of wide-ruled notebook paper. The club president, a massive man with a face like a worn catcher's mitt, read the childish scrawl in silence. His jaw tightened. "A 7-year-old girl dropped these off," Grinder said, his voice low and dangerous. "She lives 3 blocks down on Elm. They got her mother hostage, forced her stepdad to crawl under my porch last night." Breaker didn't wait for orders. He grabbed a flashlight, a set of mirrors, and a canvas tool bag, sliding on his belly into the dark, damp crawl space beneath Grinder's kitchen. The mud, the first thing she truly noticed, entruling eternity. Grinder, Dutch, and Al stood in the muddy grass, hands hovering near the heavy pistols tucked into their waistbands, eyes scanning the perimeter. Finally, Breaker slithered backward out of the darkness. He was covered in mud and spider webs, but his hands held a pair of clipped wires. He looked up at Grinder, his face entirely devoid of color. They packed 3 pipe bombs with nails and ball bearings wired to a commercial blasting cap, Breaker whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "They spliced the trigger directly into the remote receiver of your garage door. The second you hit the clicker to rotor bike out, or the second you hit the ignition switch near that wall, the whole foundation would have vaporized. You wouldn't have known what hit you." Dutch let out a string of vicious curses, spitting tobacco juice into the grass. The Vagos, they didn't want to risk a direct drive-by and start a street war with the cops watching, so they outsourced the hit to a terrified civilian. Big Al looked down at the notes in his massive hand. The bright red letters spelling, "Please save my mom," seemed to burn in the morning light. The Hells Angels were outlaws. They sold contraband, they fought violently for their territory, and they lived entirely outside the law. But they had a code. You did not involve children, and you did not terrorize innocent mothers to get to a patched member. 3 blocks down, you said? Big Al asked, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a terrifying dead calm. Yeah, Grinder replied, racking the slide of his .45 caliber 1911. The metallic clack echoed like a judge's gavel in the quiet backyard. Let's go to church. The dark sedan was still parked in the driveway of the small, peeling blue house on Elm Street. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. 3 men wearing tactical vests over green t-shirts, the signature color of the Vagos Motorcycle Club, lounged in the living room. Fake police badges hung around their necks, a ruse used to gain entry the night before. In the corner of the room, Lily's mother, Sarah, sat tied to a dining chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. Her husband, Arthur, was curled on the floor nursing broken ribs. Little Lily was locked in the bathroom down the hall, trembling in the bathtub. The Vago leader, a heavily tattooed man named Rattlesnake, checked his watch. "You should have started that Harley by now," he muttered to his accomplices. "Go check the police scanner. See if Vallejo PD is reporting an explosion." Before the man could move, the front door of the house exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted hinges. Dutch came through the threshold like a runaway freight train, leveling a 12-gauge shotgun. Big Al followed, blocking the exit. But it was Grinder who moved with the speed and ferocity of a starved wolf. Rattlesnake reached for the pistol on the coffee table, but Grinder was already on him. The Hell's Angel drove his heavy combat boot into Rattlesnake's chest, sending the Vago crashing through the glass table. The 2 other fake cops froze, staring down the barrel of Dutch's shotgun and the cold, unblinking eyes of Big Al Rossi. "Don't even twitch," Dutch growled, the hammer of the shotgun clicking back. Grinder hauled Rattlesnake off the floor by his throat, slamming him against the drywalls so hard the framed family photos rattled off their nails. Grinder pressed the hot barrel of his 1911 directly under Rattlesnake's chin. "You lost something under my house," Grinder whispered, his eyes entirely black with rage. The Vago leader swallowed hard, realizing instantly that the meticulously planned assassination had backfired. The room fell into a heavy, terrifying silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of Sarah tied to the chair. Big Al pulled a hunting knife from his belt and quickly sliced her bindings, helping her up. Grinder looked down at Arthur, the stepdad, bleeding on the carpet. "Why you?" Grinder demanded, not taking his gun off Rattlesnake. "Why did they pick your house?" "Nah, Arthur coughed, spitting blood onto the carpet. A heavy twist of guilt washed over his face. I used to run with them," Arthur confessed, his voice shaking. 10 years ago, in Reno, I skimmed from their transport. I changed my name, moved here, tried to start a family. I thought I was a ghost, but they found me. They told me if I didn't plant the bomb under your house, they would kill Sarah and Lily and make it look like a murder-suicide." Grinder's jaw clenched. The pieces fell into place. The Vagos weren't just taking out a rival Hell's Angel. They were tying up a loose end, using a traitor to do their dirty work, so the Green Nation's hands looked clean. It was cowardly, and it almost worked. "Where is the kid?" Grinder barked. "Bathroom," Sarah cried, running down the hall. She unlocked the door, pulling a terrified, weeping Lily into her arms. Grinder handed Rattlesnake over to Dutch. "Take these 3 to the warehouse by the docks," Grinder ordered, his voice devoid of any mercy. "Cipher 'em, the boys will want to have a long conversation with them about club boundaries." Dutch grinned, shoving Rattlesnake toward the back door. The fate of the 3 Vagos was sealed the moment they stepped foot in Vallejo. Grinder walked over to the hallway. He holstered his weapon and knelt, his massive, imposing frame dropping down to eye level with the little girl. Lily was shaking, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. she peeped out, her wide eyes locking onto the giant tattooed biker she had been so afraid of just yesterday. Grinder reached into his pocket. He pulled out the 3 pieces of wide-ruled notebook paper. "You wrote these?" he asked gently, his gruff voice softening to a rumble. Lily slowly nodded. "You're a brave kid," Grinder said, pulling a small silver skull ring off his pinky finger. He held it out to her. "You saved my life, Lily, and in my club, debts are paid in full. Nobody is ever going to hurt your family again. You have my word. You have the word of the Vallejo Charter." Lily hesitated, then reached out with a tiny hand and took the heavy silver ring. Within an hour, the Hells Angels had scrubbed the house of any evidence of the Vagos. Big Al handed Arthur an envelope stuffed with $20,000 in untraceable cash. It was relocation money. The Angels escorted the family's packed station wagon out of the city limits, ensuring they had safe passage to a new life, far away from the ghosts of Arthur's past. Grinder stood on his porch later that evening, watching the sunset bleed over the Vallejo skyline. The rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway stood empty. He lit a cigarette, taking a long drag. The world of an outlaw was built on violence, paranoia, and brotherhood. But as he looked down at the empty space on his pinky finger, Thomas Hayes knew that sometimes the greatest loyalty didn't come from a man wearing a 3-piece patch. Sometimes it came from a 7-year-old girl with a pencil and the courage to knock on the devil's door. Did this intense story of unexpected bravery keep you on the edge of your seat? Sometimes heroes come in the smallest sizes and justice arrives on 2 wheels. If you love this real-life biker drama, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time. The jukebox cut out mid-song. Glasses stopped blinking. 50 heavily armed bikers turned their heads as a 6'4" Hells Angel named Bull stared down at a terrified 10-year-old boy. The giant biker pointed a calloused, shaking finger at the silver pendant on the boy's neck. "Where did you get that?" It was a scorching Thursday afternoon in July 2004, the kind of Mojave Desert heat that distorted the horizon into wavy, watery mirages. The Copperhead Saloon sat just off a battered stretch of Route 66 near Needles, California, a windowless canna-block dive bar that smelled perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and decades of cigarette smoke. It was a local sanctuary, a place where people went when they didn't want to be found. Behind the scratched mahogany bar stood Maggie, a tough-as-nails woman in her late 40s who had seen just about every flavor of trouble the desert had to offer. Tucked away in the darkest corner booth, nursing a melting cherry cola, was her 10-year-old nephew, Leo. Leo was a quiet kid, small for his age, with a shock of messy brown hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room. He had been staying with Maggie for the past 3 months following the sudden death of his father. To pass the time, Leo usually sat in that exact booth, sketching in a battered spiral notebook. At exactly 3:15 p.m., a low, guttural rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards of the Copperhead. It started as a distant thunder, but quickly escalated into an ear-splitting roar. Maggie's hands froze on the pint glass she was polishing. The 3 regulars sitting at the bar immediately cashed out, leaving crumpled bills on the counter before scurrying out the back door. They knew the sound. A pack of Hells Angels was pulling into the gravel parking lot. Through the propped-open front door, Maggie watched as 24 custom Harley-Davidsons kicked up a massive cloud of dust. These weren't weekend riders. This was the San Bernardino chapter. They rode in tight formation, their leather cuts baking in the 110-degree sun. Leading the pack was Jackson Riley, known on the street simply as Bull. He was a towering mountain of a man, standing 6'4" and weighing north of 280 pounds. His forearms were covered in faded prison ink, and a jagged scar ran from his left earlobe down to his collarbone. Bull was the sergeant-at-arms, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him across state lines. Flanking him were 2 equally imposing enforcers. guys known in the local files as Dutch, Miller, and Snake Henderson. The heavy wooden front door swung wide and the daylight poured in, framing the bikers in silhouette. As they stepped into the dimly lit saloon, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of hot engine oil, sweat, and worn leather. Maggie swallowed hard. She gave Leo a sharp, silent look from across the room. "Keep your head down and stay invisible." Leo shrank back into the cracked red vinyl of the booth, pulling his knees up to his chest. "Afternoon, Maggie," Bull said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried over the twang of the country song playing on the jukebox. "Bull," Maggie nodded, keeping her voice steady. "What can I get you boys? The usual?" "Yeah, pitchers of Coors." "Keep 'em coming until we say stop," Bull commanded, leaning his massive frame against the bar. The rest of the chapter fanned out, claiming the pool tables, the dartboards, and the prime booths. They were loud, boisterous, and entirely in control of the room. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. Maggie poured beer, the bikers laughed, and Leo remained completely unnoticed in his dark corner. But the heat and the boredom were getting to the young boy. His pencil snapped against the paper of his notebook. Frustrated, he reached under the collar of his faded t-shirt to pull out the only thing he had left of his father, a heavy, custom-made silver necklace. It wasn't a standard piece of jewelry. It hung on a thick steel chain, a massive, solid silver pendant that caught the neon glow of the Budweiser sign hanging over the bar. Leo absent-mindedly rolled the heavy metal between his small fingers, feeling the familiar grooves and jagged edges of the design. Bull Riley, having just finished his second pint, pushed off the bar and began walking toward the restrooms at the back of the saloon. His heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor as he passed the shadowy alcove where Leo was sitting. A flash of reflected neon light caught his eye. Bull stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his massive head, his eyes locking onto the small boy in the booth. More specifically, his eyes locked onto the silver object dangling from the boy's hands. The sergeant-at-arms didn't move. He didn't breathe. The color literally drained from his sun-leathered face. For a man who had survived bar brawls, prison riots, and high-speed chases, he suddenly looked as though he had just seen a ghost. "Dutch," Bull snapped, his voice tight and dangerously low. Dutch Miller, who was chalking a pool cue nearby, looked up. "Yeah, Bull, kill the jukebox." Now, Dutch didn't ask questions. He walked over and ripped the cord right out of the wall. The sudden, deafening silence in the bar was terrifying. Every biker in the room stopped talking. Pool balls stopped rolling. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward their sergeant-at-arms, waiting for a command. Bull slowly approached the booth. He loomed over the table, casting a massive shadow over the trembling 10-year-old. He reached out a massive, scarred hand and pointed a calloused, shaking finger directly at the boy's chest. "Where did you get that?" The silence in the Copperhead saloon was so absolute you could hear the hum of the refrigerator compressor behind the bar. Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach. She dropped her bar towel and practically vaulted over the counter, rushing toward the booth. "Bull! Hey, Bull, back off!" "He's just a kid. He's my nephew. He doesn't know anything." Bull didn't even look at her. He just raised his left arm, holding it out like an iron gate to block Maggie from coming any closer. "I ain't gonna hurt him, Maggie," Bull said, his voice trembling with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly close to grief. "But I need to see that necklace. Right now." Leo was paralyzed. His wide, terrified eyes darted from the giant biker to his aunt. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he lifted the heavy silver chain over his head and placed the pendant on the scarred wooden table. Bull reached down and picked it up. It looked tiny in his massive palm. It was a custom-forged piece of silver, heavy and tarnished. It was shaped like a winged skull, clenching a broken motorcycle piston in its teeth. But what made it entirely unique was the right eye socket of the skull. It was set with a chipped, blood-red ruby, and the left wing had a distinct, jagged crack running through the silver, a flaw in the original casting that was never fixed. Every patch member of the San Bernardino chapter crowding around the booth instantly recognized it. Dutch Miller let out a low whistle.